My mom gave away my childhood home to her new husband, and now she's requesting my assistance after he deserted her. It was a few months back that I returned to my hometown for the initial time in ages to see my mom. I was really excited to see her, and honestly, I looked forward to spending some time at the home I grew up in. It was the house where I spent my formative years. That house was a labor of love for my dad. He put his heart and soul into building it before he passed away. It represented security for me. It was my consistent element throughout every major transition in life. However, when I finally showed up, something didn't feel quite right. Initially, the front yard was completely changed. My dad always maintained a stunning garden filled with roses, lavender, and a little apple tree, and it was all vanished. The yard was empty, replaced with a half-finished deck where the apple tree used to be. I walked up to the door and I saw the name on the mailbox didn't even belong to us anymore. Instead, it displayed his last name, my mom's new husband. Let me offer you some background information. My mom got remarried approximately 3 months ago. It took everyone by surprise. It seemed to come out of the blue, and to be honest, it felt a little hurried. She found Steve online, and within weeks they were practically joined at the hip. Initially, I was pleased for her. She appeared truly happy, and she had been lonely for a substantial period following my dad's passing. But something about Steve just didn't sit right with me. He was a decade younger than her, he was charming and glib, and he possessed this odd air of self-importance. He was the type of man who seemed almost too perfect. Anyways, I entered and the house honestly didn't resemble our house anymore. It felt like someone had removed my dad's presence from every room. The family pictures were nowhere to be seen, swapped out for modern art that Steve, I'm sure, selected. The classic furniture my mom always treasured vanished. Even Dad's favorite chair, the one I used to sit in when I was younger, had been thrown away. I asked Mom what was happening, and she just chuckled it off. Steve wanted to make it feel like their house, she explained, acting like it was insignificant. I tried to keep quiet because I didn't want to spoil the visit, but I couldn't stop myself. I said it felt like she was getting rid of our family's past, my dad's legacy, and it really stung. That's when she revealed something shocking. She'd put the house in Steve's name. I couldn't even wrap my head around it initially. I just looked at her, hoping she'd say it was a prank, but she wasn't joking. She claimed it was more convenient, and Steve had convinced her it was the right thing to do since they were now married. She went on about how it was just a formality, that nothing had really changed, except it absolutely had. It changed absolutely everything. This was the house my father had built with his own 2 hands. He put in extra hours for years to save enough money to buy the property. He mixed the concrete, put in every single window and every door. When he passed away, he left it to Mom and me. That home wasn't just a building to him, it was his lasting memory. And now, it was in the hands of some fellow my mother had only known for a short while. I questioned her about why she hadn't talked it over with me beforehand, and she became defensive. She informed me it was her property, and she could do as she pleased, and that I had no right to say anything. That felt awful. I wasn't trying to dictate her actions, but how could she not see how awful this was? Steve barely knew our family, and yet now he had possession of the place that connected us to my father. The rest of that visit was uncomfortable, to say the least. Steve was there behaving as if he had complete authority, and I suppose, technically he did. He kept discussing all the renovations he wanted to do, like taking down that old structure in the back and turning it into a special hangout for men. My dad had always worked on his things in that shed. I felt like he was ripping out the heart of that place. I did my best to stay composed, but by the time the visit concluded, I couldn't contain myself any longer. I took my mother to a quiet spot and implored her to think again. I expressed that I didn't trust Steve, that something about him gave me bad vibes. She just looked at me like I was overreacting and said, "You don't understand what it's like to be alone." I went home feeling like I had lost. Part of me wanted to sever all connection, but it's my mom. I couldn't just leave, even though I didn't approve of her choice. Something still felt off about Steve to me. He was way too keen on getting rid of anything connected to the past. I arrived at my dad's place, and a nagging feeling that he wasn't being entirely upfront plagued me. About 7 days after getting back, my mom phoned me crying. Steve intended to sell the house, my dad's place. She didn't know what she should do and pleaded with me for guidance. I wondered why she didn't try to stop him, and she started crying, confessing that since the house was solely in his name, she didn't have any legal rights anymore. I was in disbelief. She'd given away everything, our childhood home, my dad's inheritance, all because she wanted to cling to a romantic dream, and now she was suffering the consequences. The final thing she said during that call, "I suspect Steve's been deceiving me. I have no clue what is going to occur next, but I cannot just stay here and let this happen. If anyone has suggestions, I'm open to them. My dad's house means too much to me to let it go without a struggle." Follow-up. I didn't think things could be any worse after my last time visiting my mom's place. However, I was mistaken. 2 weeks after she called me, weeping about Steve's plan to sell the house, I received another call. This time, her voice was so unstable I could hardly understand what she was saying. She told me that he was gone, Steve had left, and he'd taken everything. Initially, I thought she meant he'd just walked out after an argument or something. But no, he had completely disappeared. He cleaned out their shared bank account, packed up any valuables in the house, and departed without a single word. My mother was heartbroken. She kept saying, "I don't get it," over and over. To be honest, I wasn't shocked in the slightest. I was seething. I said to her, "This is precisely why I never trusted him." She pleaded with me to come back to the house and help her sort things out. A part of me really wanted to tell her she was on her own. After all, she created this situation. But it's my mom. No matter how terrible her choices were, I couldn't abandon her in that state. When I arrived at the house, it was like stepping into a disaster zone. It was unsettling how vacant it felt. Steve had taken everything portable, electronics, jewelry, and even the pictures on the walls. But what truly gutted me was that he stole my grandmother's belongings. My father's mother had left behind a small box of antique jewelry and old letters when she died, and now it was missing. Those weren't just possessions. They represented pieces of our family's past. I asked my mom if she knew where Steve might have gone. She didn't. She told me that everything seemed normal the previous day. They even had dinner together. Then she woke up and he was gone. His phone was no longer working and all his social media accounts had been erased. It felt like he'd vanished entirely. I couldn't just let it go. I started investigating Steve's background, trying to understand who this man really was, and the things I uncovered were, to put it mildly, astonishing. Steve wasn't even his real name. I discovered at least 3 other names he went by. After some intense online searches and a couple of phone calls to people who might know him, I built up a basic sequence of events. He had experience with this type of scheme. This wasn't his first time. He'd done the same thing to at least 2 other women, charmed them, married them quickly, gotten control of their money, and vanished. The more I learned, the more furious I became. This individual was a complete fraud, and my mother had willingly given him everything. I shared my findings with her, but she didn't seem fazed at all. That's when she confessed something that made me feel sick. She had overlooked all the warning signs because she didn't want to be by herself. I struggled to keep my cool, but I couldn't help but shout. "You knew something was wrong with him, yet you still gave him Dad's house." She began to cry and said she believed she could change him, that he had promised to look after her. It was like she couldn't understand the gravity of what had just happened, but the worst part was still to come. I began to research the house itself, trying to figure out if there was any way to reclaim it. That's when I discovered Steve hadn't just intended to sell it. He had already used it as security for a huge loan. The loan was in default, meaning the house could be taken away. My childhood home was essentially lost, and there was nothing I could do to prevent it. I was enraged. I questioned my mom, asking if she knew about the loan, and she insisted she didn't. But something about her response didn't feel right. She wouldn't look at me, and she was restless. I started to wonder if she was hiding something. I was compelled to share something, and then it resurfaced. The letter I'd discovered in the attic on my previous trip, the one from my father. I hadn't read it back then because I was trying to avoid reliving painful memories, but now I felt a sense of obligation to do so. Perhaps it contained some kind of a solution. My spirits fell when I opened it. The letter was written to my mother, and in it, my father discussed his apprehension about her spending patterns, even way back then. He mentioned he had put protections in place to safeguard the house, but he wished she wouldn't have to experience that. Obviously, those protections weren't enough. Reading the letter caused me to perceive my mom differently. I'd always considered her the one wronged, but I wasn't quite so certain anymore. While she wasn't intentionally mean, she was very careless. She'd made so many poor choices it felt like she wasn't concerned about the outcomes or the impact they had on me. Once more, I confronted her, and this time she confessed she had known about the loan. Steve had persuaded her it was a wise financial move, and she'd approved it without even examining the small print. I was consumed with rage. I struggled to even look at her. I told her she let him destroy everything Dad had worked so hard for. I asked, "How could you do that?" She had no explanation. She just kept sobbing and saying she was sorry, but it didn't seem adequate. I wanted to assist her, I really did, but a part of me felt like she needed to take responsibility for what she did. The one good thing to come out of all this is that I've begun consulting with a legal professional. I'm uncertain about whether there's anything we can accomplish, but I'm not ready to concede the house. This place isn't simply a structure. It's intertwined with my family's history and a piece of my father. I won't allow some swindler to wreck that without a battle. Concerning my mother, I'm at a loss as to how to proceed. I care for her deeply, but I'm unsure if I can ever fully put my faith in her again. She claims she wants to fix things, yet I question if she even knows how to go about doing it. And Steve, should our paths cross again, he'd better hope it's in a courtroom because I have tons of inquiries and even more fury. Lately, if you've been keeping up with my situation, you know my mom gave our family home to her new husband of just a few months, Steve, who turned out to be a cheat. He drained her bank account, stole my grandmother's treasured possession, and left the house loaded with debts I didn't even know about. I originally believed that was the worst of it. I believed we were just cleaning up her mess, but I was mistaken. So profoundly mistaken. After discovering that Steve used the house to secure a questionable loan, I began working with a lawyer. It's not economical, but I didn't care. This house wasn't simply some piece of real estate. It represented my father's lasting impact. Losing it was not going to happen. My mother, on the other hand, appeared completely crushed. She kept saying things like, "It's too late, and I don't deserve your help." At first, I thought she had just given up. I was drowning in guilt, which hit me pretty hard. However, it dawned on me that she was keeping something from me. The moment everything shifted was when we discovered a clue that brought us to another of Steve's targets. We'll refer to her as Lisa. She was nice enough to speak with me after I described my circumstances. Lisa's account echoed mine in a disturbing way. Steve charmed her, moved in with her, persuaded her to give him her possessions, and vanished. But here's the surprise. Lisa revealed that Steve always had a secondary plan, typically a secret money supply he hid before leaving. That was when I began to feel a sliver of optimism. I commenced a thorough search of every area of the residence. I was determined to find anything Steve had concealed. While rummaging through the attic, I found something that I hadn't seen previously. An old metal box hidden underneath some insulation. My pulse was quickening as I forced it open, only to find a collection of letters. But they weren't from Steve. They were from my father. The majority of the letters were affectionate, addressed to my mother when they were first married, but one stood out. It was written a few months before my father passed away, and in it, he discussed the house. He said he'd always been concerned about my mother remarrying after his death. He said that he had considered putting the house in a trust to protect it, but ultimately decided against it because he had faith in her ability to make sound decisions. I was overcome with a blend of sadness and rage. My father had placed his trust in her, and she gave everything to a con man. But as I continued reading, another thing grabbed my attention. My dad had written that he'd set aside a little something for a rainy day. He added that I'd know how to find it. What could that mean? I turned back to looking around the house, this time approaching it differently. If Dad concealed something, it had to be in a significant spot. After spending quite a bit of time looking, I finally stumbled upon it. A small metal container was tucked away behind the basement wall where he stored his tools. Inside the box were some papers, an old will, financial information, and the most important thing, the original deed to the house. My father had never actually transferred the house fully into Mom's name. In reality, a part of it still belonged to me. This meant I had a legal basis to challenge Steve's loan. I wasn't sure I'd win, but at least I had a chance. When I showed the documents to Mom, she looked as if she'd seen a ghost. She first looked a bit shaken. Then she told me something that sent shivers down my spine. She knew about all of this. She confessed. She just didn't think I needed to be aware of it. I just stood there staring at her, completely unable to say anything. What did she mean she knew? You allowed me to think everything was lost. That's when she started to cry and told me the real story. She wasn't as unaware of Steve as she'd let on. She knew he wasn't completely on the up and up, but she went along with his plans since she thought they'd be able to start anew. She even agreed to the loan despite knowing it was a gamble since she believed she could fix the situation down the road. When everything crumbled, she freaked out and let me think she was completely caught off guard. She told me, "I didn't want you to despise me. I just didn't know what to say." I felt like I wasn't even sure who my mother was anymore. For what felt like ages, I'd been going above and beyond to support her, only to discover that she'd been deceiving me this entire time. However, here's the deal. Discovering my father's hidden papers altered everything. I was able to fight the mortgage in court, contending that Steve never truly possessed full legal title to the property. It required endless rounds of negotiation, but eventually we prevailed. The house was once more mine. Once everything was finalized, I informed my mother that I needed some distance. I truly love her, but I'm unable to erase how her decisions almost caused us to lose all that my dad had worked for. She's been trying to make things right, but it's going to take an eternity to rebuild my trust in her. As for Steve, he's still out there somewhere. I've connected with several of his other targets, and we're working in tandem to build a case against him. Hopefully, he'll get his just desserts someday. The home is finally mine, and I've begun to renovate it. It has been an extended, difficult experience, but standing within those walls now, surrounded by recollections of my dad, I feel like I've taken back something I thought was gone for good. It is more than just a house. It's my sanctuary again. And just when I believed the ordeal was over, there was one final surprise. A woman arrived at my doorstep. A couple of weeks back, a woman showed up clutching an infant. She told me she was trying to find Steve, saying he was the dad. I honestly have no clue how to process that whole thing, but I am certain of one thing. This whole situation definitely isn't resolved.